The courtroom grew quiet as the judge gave Jake the floor. Everyone was waiting to see what the teenager would do. Even though they thought this would be an easy win for the prosecution, something about Jake made them curious. Maybe they were expecting him to stumble over his words or not know how to handle the questions. But Jake wasn't like the other teens they had seen before. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow as Jake stood up to speak. He was still skeptical. This kid, with no formal legal training, couldn't possibly be prepared for what was about to happen. Jake cleared his throat softly and looked around the room. His eyes met the judges, then the prosecutors, and finally the jury. Despite being just a teenager, Jake felt no fear. He had done his homework, and this was his moment to prove it. "Your Honor," Jake began, his voice steady and clear, "I would like to cross-examine Officer Anderson, the person who gave me this citation." Judge Harrington frowned but nodded, motioning for the officer to approach the witness stand. Jake turned to the officer, who looked slightly puzzled at being questioned by someone so young. Jake started asking simple, but precise, questions about the events leading up to the citation. At first, the officer answered without hesitation, but Jake's next questions made him pause. "Officer Anderson, you mentioned that I was speeding, but was there a clear speed sign posted in the area?" Jake asked, his voice calm. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, no, there wasn't a clear sign right where I was, but I know it's a 35 miles per hour zone." Jake didn't let him off the hook. "So you couldn't actually confirm the speed limit at that exact spot?" The officer hesitated. "No, I guess not." Jake's next question cut even deeper. "Officer, how sure are you that the speed radar was properly calibrated?" The officer shifted in his seat again, clearly uncomfortable. I don't remember if it was checked that day." The courtroom was silent now, and even the judge looked up from his paperwork, interested. The prosecutor sat back, clearly not expecting Jake to be this prepared. Jake wasn't just asking questions, he was pointing out the gaps in the officer's story. Jake continued, his questions getting sharper and more focused. He didn't just stop at the officer's testimony. He asked about the weather conditions, the visibility, and the exact location of where the radar was used. Each time the officer hesitated or gave an unsure answer, Jake added another piece to the puzzle. At this point, the prosecutor was visibly annoyed. He hadn't planned on being challenged like this. "Objection, Your Honor," he called out, but the judge simply waved him off. "I'm going to let the boy ask his questions," Judge Harrington said, surprising everyone in the room. Jake wasn't trying to be arrogant or overconfident. He was just focused, determined to show that there were flaws in the case against him. The more he asked, the more the prosecutor's case began to unravel. By the time Jake finished his questions, the courtroom was buzzing with whispers. People were looking at him differently now, including the judge. Judge Harrington leaned forward, clearly intrigued. He had expected a simple case, but instead, he was watching a young teenager hold his ground like a seasoned lawyer. Jake sat down again, but he wasn't done yet. He knew this was just the beginning. He had already planted the seeds of doubt in the case against him. And the best part was, he still had more to come. As Jake sat back down at the defendant's table, he could feel the weight of the room's attention on him. The once dismissive looks from the judge, the prosecutor, and even the audience had shifted. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, but this time they weren't filled with disbelief. They were filled with curiosity. People were starting to wonder, who was this teenager, really? Jake could tell the prosecutor was getting rattled. Mr. Davis had expected this trial to be quick, a simple case where he could prove his point and be done with it. But now, it seemed like everything was slipping through his fingers. The officer's testimony was full of holes, and Jake had exposed them one by one. The prosecutor had lost his confident smile and was now flipping through his papers, trying to find something to salvage the situation. Judge Harrington, who had been skeptical of Jake from the start, now sat forward, his hands folded. He didn't look amused anymore. Instead, he was watching Jake closely, as though trying to figure out how the teenager had managed to turn the tables. Jake hadn't just been asking questions. He had been making a point of showing that the evidence wasn't as solid as it seemed. The prosecutor finally regained his composure, standing up and trying to reassert control over the situation. "Your Honor, I would like to call my next witness," he said, but Jake wasn't done. "I'm not finished yet." Jake spoke up, and the room went silent. Everyone turned to him, surprised. It was rare for a defendant, especially one so young, to speak with such authority in the middle of the trial. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Mr. Lawson," he said, clearly intrigued. Jake stood again, his movements calm and steady. He walked over to the evidence table, scanning the documents in front of him. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He just needed to make sure he had everything in order. "Your Honor, I'd like to point out a couple more things," Jake said, addressing the judge in the courtroom. His voice was still as clear and confident as it had been before. He began to explain the legal principles behind the case, showing how the officer's account didn't match the standard procedures for traffic citations. He spoke about how traffic laws worked in specific situations like the one he had been in. What amazed everyone in the room was that Jake didn't sound like a teenager who had just learned the basics of law. He sounded like someone who had studied it for years. The prosecutor, now visibly flustered, tried to interrupt. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant." Jake didn't stop. He calmly turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not making irrelevant points. I'm showing that this case doesn't have the evidence needed to support the claim against me." The judge, surprisingly, nodded. He wasn't quick to agree with the young defendant, but there was something in Jake's arguments that made sense. He didn't rush to shut him down. As Jake continued, he referenced past cases that had similar circumstances, demonstrating how those had been ruled in favor of the defendant. He showed that the officer's testimony was unreliable and that the prosecution hadn't provided enough evidence. The more Jake spoke, the more it became clear that the prosecution was losing ground fast. People in the courtroom exchanged looks of disbelief. The defense wasn't just making a case, it was dismantling the prosecution's entire argument. Even Judge Harrington had to acknowledge that Jake was more than just a teenager in over his head. The young man was proving himself to be a force to be reckoned with. When Jake finished speaking, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence. It wasn't just the prosecutor who was rattled now. Even the judge looked deep in thought. Jake wasn't just defending himself. He was showing everyone that he wasn't the naive teenager they had assumed. He was proving that he had the skills to stand toe-to-toe with seasoned legal professionals. At that moment, Jake knew the trial had shifted completely in his favor. The hard part was over. Now, all that was left was for the judge to see the truth in the way Jake had laid out the case. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Jake sat down, his mind racing with the knowledge that he had just pulled off something incredible. It wasn't just his victory in questioning the officer. It was the way he had kept his cool, proving with each word that he was not someone to be underestimated. The room was still buzzing with the disbelief of what they had just witnessed. Even the judge, who had initially thought this would be a simple case, now looked at Jake with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Judge Harrington leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling as he observed Jake with a critical eye. The courtroom had shifted, and not just in terms of the case. Jake had made it clear that this was no ordinary trial. The atmosphere had changed from one of mockery to one of respect. People were beginning to realize that the teenager standing in front of them wasn't just trying to get out of a ticket. He was carefully and skillfully dismantling the prosecution's case. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, stood up again, trying to regain control. His face was flushed, his voice tinged with frustration. "Your Honor," he began, "I would like to call my next witness to the stand." He was clearly desperate to shift the focus away from Jake and back onto something, anything that might salvage his case. But Jake wasn't ready to let him off the hook yet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe I've made my point clear. There's no need for further witnesses because the evidence just isn't there. A murmur ran through the courtroom. People were starting to look at Jake in a different light. They had expected him to buckle under pressure, to mess up or falter, but instead, he had kept his composure, questioning everything, proving that the case against him wasn't as solid as it appeared. Judge Harrington raised an eyebrow, his hands now resting on the desk in front of him. "Mr. Lawson, you're sure you don't want to call any witnesses of your own?" he asked, his tone still skeptical, but also intrigued. Jake nodded confidently. "I don't need any more witnesses, Your Honor. I've already proven that the case is full of holes." The judge thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said, clearly impressed by Jake's confidence. "We'll proceed with closing arguments." The prosecutor looked visibly rattled. He had planned on this trial being a simple win, a quick and easy case, but Jake had taken control of the courtroom. With every word, every point he made, the young defendant had chipped away at the prosecution's foundation. Mr. Davis had thought that a teenager wouldn't know enough to mount a real defense, but Jake had just shown everyone that knowledge, focus, and preparation could make all the difference. As the closing arguments began, Jake stood up once more, his posture straight and unwavering. He spoke not only to the judge but to the entire room, laying out his points one final time. He summarized everything he had said: how the officer had failed to provide clear evidence, how the radar wasn't properly calibrated, and how the case had no solid foundation. He spoke with such clarity and precision that even the prosecutor couldn't find a way to object. When Jake finished, the courtroom was silent. People sat back, amazed at the young man who had just stood up to the system. The prosecutor was left without words, and the judge's expression had softened. For the first time in the trial, Judge Harrington seemed to acknowledge something important. This wasn't just a teenager fighting for a ticket. This was a young person who knew exactly what he was doing. The courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary that day. They hadn't just seen a defendant defending himself. They had seen a teenager outsmart the system with intelligence, preparation, and an unwavering belief in himself. Jake took his seat, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. He didn't know how the trial would end, but he knew one thing for sure: he had already won. As the room fell into silence, Jake sat still, his eyes locked on Judge Harrington. The quiet tension in the courtroom seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. Everyone was waiting for the judge to make a decision. But Judge Harrington wasn't quick to speak. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face, deep in thought. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. Jake knew that the next step would be crucial. He had laid out his case clearly, but he could sense that the judge, although impressed, still had doubts. Judge Harrington had seen countless defendants come and go, but none of them had ever taken control of the courtroom like Jake had. He had expected an easy trial, but Jake had made sure that wasn't going to happen. Now the judge seemed to be evaluating him, not just as a defendant, but as someone who had shown a rare skill and knowledge. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, was standing off to the side, nervously adjusting his glasses. He had clearly hoped that the trial would end in a quick victory, but Jake had completely turned things around. It was clear to everyone that the prosecutor had underestimated him. Jake had exposed the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, and now Mr. Davis didn't know how to salvage it. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Harrington finally broke the silence. He looked at Jake with an expression that was hard to read. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I have to admit, you've managed to make a convincing argument here today. But I'm going to ask you something that might seem a bit unusual." Jake tilted his head, not sure what the judge was getting at, but he was ready for whatever came next. "Go ahead, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. Judge Harrington leaned forward slightly, studying Jake with a new intensity. "How did you know all this? You're just a teenager. Most people your age wouldn't even know where to begin in a courtroom." Jake didn't hesitate. He looked the judge directly in the eye and answered with surprising honesty. I've spent years studying the law, Your Honor. I've read case files, learned the basics of legal theory, and practiced with mock trials. I've always been interested in law, and I don't take things at face value. When I see something that isn't right, I investigate it. The judge's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of surprise and curiosity. He wasn't expecting such a direct answer, especially not from someone so young. He had expected Jake to be nervous, to fumble over his words. But instead, Jake spoke with the kind of conviction that you would expect from someone much older, someone who had been in the field for years. Judge Harrington sat back, clearly processing Jake's words. "Well," he said after a long pause, "it seems that you've done your homework, Mr. Lawson. I'm not sure if I've ever seen a defendant quite like you before." Jake remained calm, not letting the judge's words throw him off. He wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted to make sure that his case was understood. But the truth was, he had hoped for this moment. The moment when the judge would finally realize that he wasn't just some teenager trying to talk his way out of trouble. Jake had shown that he had a mind capable of doing much more. Judge Harrington shifted his gaze back to the prosecutor, who was still standing awkwardly at the side. "Mr. Davis," the judge said, his tone now more serious, "do you have anything else to add?" Mr. Davis looked around, clearly caught off guard by the direction the trial had taken. He shook his head, his confidence from earlier completely gone. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice small. "I believe the case has been made." The judge turned back to Jake. "It seems you've won this round, Mr. Lawson," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You've certainly made your point." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't just winning the case anymore. He was earning respect. He had done what so many people thought was impossible. In a courtroom full of adults, he had managed to hold his own and show everyone that age didn't determine ability. As the courtroom waited for the judge's final ruling, Jake sat back in his seat, feeling more confident than ever. He had done everything he could to make his case. Now, it was up to the judge to decide how this strange, unexpected trial would end. But no matter what happened, Jake knew that he had already won something far more valuable than just a ticket dismissal. He had won the respect of everyone in the room. The courtroom was filled with an almost electric stillness as everyone waited for Judge Harrington to speak. The weight of his decision was clearly felt by everyone in the room. Jake, sitting at the defendant's table, kept his posture straight, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. He had already made his arguments, shown the weaknesses in the prosecution's case, and demonstrated more than anyone had expected from a teenager. Now, all he could do was wait. The judge looked over his papers one last time, as though reviewing the entire case in his mind. He'd been in this position hundreds of times, but this time was different. He had seen defendants struggle, he had seen them scramble to prove their innocence, and he had seen seasoned lawyers make their cases. But this was the first time he had seen a young person, with little more than determination and a lot of knowledge, take control of a trial in such a manner. Judge Harrington had to admit that Jake's performance had impressed him. Finally, the judge looked up. His gaze shifted between Jake and the prosecutor, who was still standing, but now looked slightly defeated. "Mr. Lawson," Judge Harrington began, his voice steady, "I've listened carefully to both sides. You've presented your case with an impressive level of detail and clarity." Jake's heart beat a little faster, but he didn't let it show. He kept his expression neutral, waiting for the judge to continue. "Normally, I would expect a teenager to fumble through something like this, but you've proven yourself to be quite the opposite," the judge said, surprising Jake with his directness. The words felt like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. He had done it. He had earned the respect of the judge. Judge Harrington paused for a moment, his eyes briefly scanning the courtroom before returning to Jake. "Your understanding of the law, your approach to questioning, and the way you've pointed out the flaws in the prosecution's case, it's impressive, to say the least." Jake felt a rush of pride, but he quickly reminded himself to stay focused. this wasn't over yet. The judge shifted his gaze to the prosecutor, Mr. Davis, who was now standing with his arms crossed, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Mr. Davis, do you have anything else to add?" Judge Harrington asked, his tone still firm but fair. Mr. Davis hesitated. He knew the case wasn't going in his favor, but he had to try something. "Your Honor, I believe we still have some evidence that could help support our case," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Judge Harrington shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Mr. Davis. "I've heard everything, Mr. Davis," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "The evidence you've presented has been questioned and found lacking. Your witness, Officer Anderson, couldn't provide clear answers. And frankly, the rest of your case doesn't hold up under scrutiny." Jake felt a rush of satisfaction. He had known it all along. The case against him was built on weak ground. He had simply needed to show everyone else what he had seen. The judge's next words confirmed what Jake had hoped for. "Given the lack of solid evidence and the points raised by Mr. Lawson, I find that the charges against him cannot stand." The room went quiet. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had won. He had really done it. Judge Harrington stood up, his gavel in hand, and looked around the courtroom. "The case is dismissed," he said, his voice firm and final. "Mr. Lawson, you are free to go." Jake's mind was still catching up with the words. He had come into this courtroom expecting to defend himself, but now, hearing the judge's decision, it felt like a victory beyond what he had imagined. He hadn't just avoided the ticket. He had proven to everyone in the room, especially to himself, that age and experience didn't always define who could win a case. The prosecutor didn't say a word as he sat down, defeated, but Jake hardly noticed. His attention was on Judge Harrington, who was now looking at him with a slight nod of approval. As Jake gathered his things to leave, he felt a sense of pride that was hard to describe. He had walked in there as a teenager with little more than a strong belief in himself, and he had left the courtroom with something far more valuable: respect. People in the courtroom began to murmur, clearly impressed by what they had just witnessed. Jake had turned what should have been a simple case into something much bigger, something that would be remembered for a long time. As Jake walked out of the courtroom, he couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about winning. It was about showing the world that anything was possible, no matter how young you were. As Jake stepped out of the courtroom, a wave of relief washed over him. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had done it. The moment he had been preparing for, thinking about, and working towards for so long was finally over. He had won the case, but more than that, he had proven something far more important: that no matter his age, he was capable of achieving something remarkable. Outside the courthouse, Jake could already see a small crowd gathering. Word had spread quickly, and people were curious to see the young defendant who had taken on the system and come out victorious. Reporters, camera phones, and even curious bystanders all turned to Jake as he walked down the steps. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but today, that was exactly what he was. His mind raced as he processed everything that had just happened. It seemed unreal. He had gone into the courtroom just hoping for a fair chance, but the experience had become something much bigger. It wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about standing up for himself, using his knowledge to make a difference. He had taken on a professional prosecutor and a seasoned officer, and he had come out on top. As he walked toward the crowd, a reporter approached him, microphone in hand. "Excuse me, young man," the reporter said, her voice eager. "How does it feel to have won your case today?" She was clearly fascinated by his success. Jake paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him how he felt, but this time, the question felt different. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about something bigger, something that had changed in him throughout the trial. "It feels incredible," Jake said, his voice steady. "But more than that, it feels like a reminder that with hard work and determination, Anything is possible. Age doesn't define what you can do. The reporter smiled and nodded, impressed by his maturity. That's a great perspective, she said, before asking another question. What inspired you to defend yourself in court? Most teenagers wouldn't even think about it. Jake thought for a moment, his gaze drifting upward as if recalling something deep inside him. I've always been interested in law, he began, his voice thoughtful. But beyond that, I've always believed that if something isn't right, you should speak up. I didn't think the evidence was strong enough to convict me, so I just decided to do something about it. The crowd around him seemed to hang on every word, listening with a mix of admiration and awe. Jake hadn't just fought for his own freedom. He had given them a lesson in courage, confidence, and the importance of standing up for what's right. As Jake finished talking to the reporter, he saw his parents approaching from the side. They had been in the courtroom throughout the trial, and though they hadn't said much during the proceedings, Jake knew they had been silently supporting him every step of the way. His mom gave him a big hug, and his dad patted him on the back. "We're so proud of you, son," his dad said, his voice filled with pride. "I couldn't have done it without your encouragement," Jake replied, smiling at them both. Jake's victory was more than just legal. It was a personal triumph, a statement that no matter where you came from, no matter how old you were, your voice mattered. He had done something that most adults would have found difficult to do, and he had done it with confidence and poise. But more importantly, he had done it by trusting in himself and in the hard work he had put in to understand the law. As Jake walked away from the courthouse with his family, he couldn't help but reflect on how much he had learned. It wasn't just about the facts and the laws. It was about the strength to stand firm, to believe in your own abilities, and to never let anyone tell you what you're capable of based on your age. Jake had proved that even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, determination could make all the difference. That night, as he sat down to review the day's events in his journal, Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He wasn't just writing about a legal victory. He was writing about a personal victory, a victory over doubt, over expectation, and over the idea that being young meant you had to wait for your time. Jake had taken his time and used it wisely. And that had made all the difference. Jake Lawson walked into the courtroom, his sneakers squeaking lightly on the polished floor. At just 17 years old, he looked more like a high school student running late for class than someone about to face a legal battle. His messy hair and casual t-shirt contrasted with the stern, traditional atmosphere of the courtroom. Everything from the wooden desks to the dark robes worn by the judge and lawyers felt distant and intimidating. Jake had been charged with a minor infraction, a ticket he claimed he didn't deserve. But that wasn't the real reason he was there. His decision to represent himself in court was what set him apart from everyone else. The idea of a teenager taking on the legal system on his own seemed absurd to most. But Jake had his reasons, and he believed he could do it. As he sat down at the defendant's table, the judge, a man in his late 50s named Judge Harrington, looked down at Jake through his glasses. His eyes narrowed, scanning the young boy. He had seen countless defendants before. Most of them had little to no experience with the law, and were often at the mercy of their lawyers. But something about Jake caught his attention. Maybe it was the way Jake seemed calm, or how his sharp gaze never wavered. The judge cleared his throat and smirked slightly. "So, you're representing yourself, huh? This should be interesting," he said in a voice that oozed sarcasm. His words hung in the air, and a few people in the courtroom chuckled. Jake didn't flinch. He sat up straighter in his seat and looked the judge in the eye, his posture confident, despite the laughter around him. He had been in tough situations before, but this was a different kind of challenge. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of disbelief and amusement. The prosecutor, a man named Mr. Davis, adjusted his glasses and glanced at Jake with a slight shake of his head. He didn't take the teenager seriously, and neither did the others. "This is going to be a quick win," Davis whispered to his colleague, barely hiding a smile. Jake knew what people thought of him. He wasn't blind to the smirks or the whispers, But it didn't matter. His mind was focused on the task ahead. He had come to court for one reason: to clear his name. He wasn't about to let anyone underestimate him. Judge Harrington gave a loud sigh, signaling for the trial to begin. The prosecutor stood up, presenting his case. It seemed straightforward. Jake had been caught violating a traffic rule, and the evidence seemed clear. But as Mr. Davis went on, Jake paid close attention, quietly taking notes. The judge seemed bored, his fingers drumming on the desk. "Is this really worth my time?" he muttered, clearly expecting Jake to fail. He didn't expect the teenager to have any real knowledge of the law. The first round of the trial was nothing special. The prosecutor presented his case, confident that victory was inevitable. Jake listened intently, nodding along, but his mind was working in overdrive. He was analyzing every word, every detail. He wasn't just listening, he was preparing. As the prosecutor finished, the room waited for Jake to speak. All eyes were on him. With a deep breath, Jake stood up. He wasn't nervous. He knew the questions he needed to ask. He knew the holes in the prosecution's case. And most importantly, he was ready to prove that he wasn't just some kid. He was about to show everyone exactly what he was capable of. Jake's victory in court had brought him a sense of accomplishment, but as the days passed, he began to realize that it was more than just about winning a legal case. His experience had changed him. It wasn't just the respect he had earned from the judge, or the awe he had seen in the faces of the people in the courtroom. It was the realization that he had done something few people his age could ever imagine. The days after the trial were filled with media attention. Interviews, local news reports, and even social media exploded with praise for the young genius attorney. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from classmates, family members, and even people he didn't know. It was overwhelming at first, but Jake knew that he had earned it. He had worked hard, not just for this trial, but for years before it. His passion for law, his dedication to learning, and his willingness to stand up for what he believed in had led him to this moment. Despite the media attention, Jake remained grounded. He knew that this moment didn't define him, but it was a stepping stone to something greater. People were beginning to see him in a new light, and he knew that the experiences he had gained would shape his future. More than that, it made him realize that he had a bigger role to play. He had always dreamed of being a lawyer, but now he saw that he could do even more. He could use his talents to help others, to fight for justice, and to challenge the system when it wasn't fair. Jake's victory also sparked a conversation in his community about age, ability, and potential. People began to look at young people differently, realizing that sometimes the next great lawyer, doctor, or leader wasn't going to look like what they expected. Jake's story became an inspiration to others. Teenagers in his school, and even younger kids, began to approach him, asking questions about how he had managed to defend himself in court, how he had learned about the law, and how they, too, could follow their dreams, no matter how impossible they seemed. Jake found himself becoming a role model in his own way, but it wasn't something he had planned for. He hadn't set out to be a symbol of success or inspiration. He had simply done what felt right. Yet the more he reflected on his journey, the more he realized that his actions had made a lasting impact. He wasn't just an ordinary teenager anymore. He was someone who had proven that if you put in the work, stay focused, and believe in yourself, you could accomplish incredible things. Months after the trial, Jake received an unexpected call. It was from a local law firm who had heard about his victory and were impressed by his legal knowledge. They offered him an internship, saying that they saw great potential in him and wanted to help him grow in the field. It was a huge opportunity, one that could fast-track his career in law. Jake was both surprised and excited. He had always dreamed of working with professionals in the field, and now he had the chance to learn from them. His family was thrilled about the opportunity, but they also reminded him to stay true to himself and continue his education. Jake had already planned his future carefully, knowing that his ultimate goal was to attend law school and become a lawyer who could make a difference. But the internship was the perfect way to get his foot in the door, and he knew that it would give him valuable experience that he could use for years to come. As Jake walked into the law office for his first day as an intern, he couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. He had come a long way since that day in the courtroom. The experience had not only made him stronger, it had helped him see the endless possibilities ahead. He wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was someone who had shown the world that age didn't define what you could achieve. And this was just the first step in a much bigger journey. Jake's journey was far from over. His victory in court was only the start of a bright future filled with possibilities. Whether it was law, activism, or any other field, he knew that he had the potential to make a real difference. He had proven it to himself and to everyone who had ever doubted him. And as he sat down at his desk, ready to begin his first day at the law firm, Jake realized that his story was only beginning.